There's a strange silence at the heart of First Blood, a silence made not of peace but of aftershocks. You can almost hear the hum of an America recalibrating after a decade of moral and political trauma. Out of that hush walks a lone figure, John Rambo, a man who has outlived his mission but not his memories. His story, on the surface, looks like an action survival tale set in a misty Pacific Northwest town. Yet beneath the camouflage and the muscle lies a profound economic experiment. Can Hollywood turn trauma, alienation, and guilt into marketable spectacle without losing its soul? When Carolco Pictures and Orion partnered to produce this film in 1982, they were gambling more than just $15 million of budgeted capital. They were wagering on the American appetite for catharsis, testing whether audiences would pay to watch a man not conquer but collapse. Sylvester Stallone, already a blue-chip cinematic brand after Rocky, was both creative talent and financial hedge. His presence guaranteed investor confidence. His rewrite of the script reduced risk by aligning Rambo's brutality with vulnerability. Every studio involved treated this not just as storytelling, but as portfolio management, a distressed emotional asset being refinanced into a blockbuster. The early 80s were a volatile cinematic economy. The Vietnam War had ended less than a decade earlier, yet its cinematic derivatives, the Deer Hunter, Apocalypse Now, Coming Home, had already extracted their artistic returns. By 1982, the market seemed oversaturated with melancholy. Action cinema, on the other hand, was becoming a growth sector, propelled by the emerging VHS boom and male-centric merchandising. The calculus was simple. If you could engineer empathy within violence, you'd own both the critics and the toy shelves. First Blood became the proof of concept for that hybrid model, an emotionally literate action thriller that spoke fluently in the languages of both grief and profit. The narrative's opening moves are deceptively modest. Rambo drifts into Hope, Washington, a town whose very name feels ironic capital branding. He's looking for an old comrade, only to find him dead from cancer caused by Agent Orange exposure. What begins as a handshake with memory turns into an arrest by small-town authority, and from there into a violent spiral. Yet every frame is engineered for efficiency, a lesson in cinematic supply chain management. Director Ted Kotcheff shoots the forest like a manufacturing floor of tension, every tree a potential cost center, every footstep a calculated use of sound design. Technologically, the film sits at an inflection point. The Steadicam revolution had democratized dynamic movement without the expense of cranes. Lightweight Aeroflex cameras allowed handheld sequences that blended intimacy with kinetic precision, reducing production overhead while increasing emotional yield. The film's cold palette, all moss green and steel gray, wasn't just an aesthetic choice, it was a data-driven one. Cooler tones tested better with audiences for psychological thrillers, reinforcing the emotional temperature of isolation. Color grading at that time was chemical, not digital, yet the results were quantified through preview screenings like product trials. What makes First Blood industrially fascinating is its internal ROI cycle. For a $15 million investment, it returned nearly $125 million worldwide, an 8-fold multiplier, extraordinary even by 1980s standards. That profitability wasn't accidental. The marketing division, led by the then upstart Carolco executives, leveraged Stallone's brand equity and targeted the newly globalized cable TV market. Posters emphasized silhouette, not gore, selling not the man but the myth, a strategy that extended product shelf life beyond theaters. But numbers alone don't explain its endurance. The movie struck a national nerve because it quantified post-war shame. In behavioral economics terms, Rambo represented negative equity, a soldier over-leveraged on loyalty whose nation defaulted on him. Each act of violence is a forced liquidation of faith. The sheriff, played by Brian Dennehy, functions as small-town authority protecting domestic markets from foreign imports. In this case, a foreignized veteran. The resulting clash becomes an allegory of protectionism versus globalization, years before those terms entered political discourse. From a creative engineering perspective, Stallone's performance operates like a controlled burn in a failing factory. He modulates between stillness and explosion with mechanical precision, every twitch, a micro-investment in empathy. The editing, handled with scalpel rhythm, keeps ROI on suspense high while minimizing narrative waste. Kotcheff treats nature not as backdrop but as operating system. Wet soil, fog, and rock form a kind of analog coding language that tells us how trapped humans can become in environments that once promised freedom. There's also something deeply technological about the film's soundscape. The constant rain, the helicopter rotors, even the echo of Rambo's breath in the cave, all mixed on analog consoles, act like an early version of immersive audio, predicting the eventual rise of Dolby Surround. Each sound decision was a data point in emotional engineering, how much decibel range before fear becomes fatigue. When you step back, First Blood reveals itself not as a simple war movie but as a cross-disciplinary startup. It's where psychology meets logistics, where emotion is capitalized and weaponized. It teaches us that cinema, like technology, thrives on iteration. Sequels would later inflate both the budget and the body count, but this first entry remains lean, a minimum viable product of rage. And that's the paradox that keeps First Blood relevant 4 decades later. It's about a man who can't find work, who's punished for persistence, and who breaks when the system refuses to amortize his pain. In industrial terms, Rambo isn't a hero or a villain. He's a depreciating asset in a patriotic balance sheet. The tragedy is not that he fights, it's that he was built to. The film opens not with spectacle but with a ghost wandering through daylight. Rambo moves down a dirt road framed by mountains that feel both majestic and indifferent, his green fatigue jacket hanging loose like a flag that no longer belongs to any nation. This introduction functions as the startup's prototype phase, the quiet stage where the marketable product hasn't yet been defined. The investor here is empathy, the commodity is alienation. The camera invests in Rambo's silence, letting us interpret it as both data and mystery. When he discovers his last surviving brother-in-arms has died, the business case collapses. The promise that loyalty yields dividends is void. From this emotional bankruptcy, the narrative begins its first fiscal quarter. Rambo versus the structure of normal society. As he enters the small town of Hope, Sheriff Teasel's patrol car glides into frame, representing institutional oversight, the local regulator of human behavior. Their interaction is a masterclass in behavioral economics. Rambo's calm compliance is met with bureaucratic hostility. The sheriff perceives not a veteran but a liability on his civic balance sheet. This encounter, seemingly trivial, triggers the film's entire supply chain of conflict. Teasel's decision to escort Rambo out of town, a gesture of local brand protection, becomes a forced delisting from the marketplace of belonging. Yet Rambo walks back, symbolically re-entering the market from which he was expelled. In project management terms, this is the moment of scope creep. The narrative expands beyond what the local system can handle. Once arrested, the film moves from open landscape to confined space, from macroeconomics to microeconomics. The police station sequence is shot with brutal efficiency. Fluorescent light flickers over concrete, the production design deliberately minimizing cost while maximizing psychological yield. Every action inside that station feels like data collection, the town testing the product's tolerance under stress. When Rambo's trauma resurfaces during the delousing scene, we witness the recall of an old operating system corrupted by wartime code. His flashbacks to the POW camp function like background processes hijacking the CPU of his mind. From a structural analysis, this is the perfect escalation curve. Each humiliation compounds interest on Rambo's suppressed violence. When he finally breaks free, punching officers, seizing a motorbike, tearing through streets, it's not random chaos, it's capital reallocation. The narrative's liquidity shifts from authority to survival. Kochev's direction uses handheld cinematography to simulate volatility, the visual equivalent of a market crash. The viewer's pulse becomes the film's volatility index. As Rambo speeds toward the forest, the tonal economy transforms. The town's man-made order gives way to nature's anarchic algorithms. The forest is filmed like an emerging technology, unpredictable, vast, unregulated. Here, Rambo's specialized training becomes competitive advantage. Each survival tactic, lighting a fire, sewing a wound, setting traps, reads like R&D documentation from a soldier engineer. The screenplay smartly quantifies his skills, turning them into case studies of resource optimization. With a piece of tarp, some rope, and a knife, he manufactures autonomy, a startup founder rebooting after corporate rejection. Meanwhile, the sheriff's department mobilizes its resources, escalating the chase with helicopters, dogs, and manpower, overinvestment chasing diminishing returns. Their financial metaphor is simple: bureaucracy spends more to control less. Every bullet fired into the forest is a sunk cost. The forest, with its fog and steep cliffs, becomes a balance sheet of hubris, punishing those who mistake control for profit. Cinematically, this first half thrives on contrasts and operational tempo. Inside town limits, the cinematography favors linear geometry, roads, fences, walls, symbols of regulation. In the forest, lines dissolve into organic chaos. The handheld camera becomes a free market of motion. Jerry Goldsmith's score shifts accordingly, layering analog synths beneath mournful orchestration, like data signals bleeding into human emotion. The sonic palette mirrors America's early 80s identity crisis, half technological optimism, half post-industrial melancholy. The helicopter sequence marks the first major liquidity event of the plot. As Rambo clings to the cliff face and the deputy fires recklessly, the narrative tests its risk threshold. When the deputy falls to his death, it's the film's first casualty, not just of violence but of arrogance. Rambo's immediate reaction, shouting that it wasn't intentional, is a moral audit. The system interprets him as rogue capital. He still views himself as regulated by conscience. At this midpoint of the first half, First Blood achieves operational self-awareness. The movie understands it's no longer about one man versus many, but one efficient organism versus a bloated institution. Each branch he bends, each trap he lays, reaffirms that asymmetry is profitable, agility beats scale. When Rambo ambushes the search party, using guerrilla logic over brute force, it's as if the narrative demonstrates the superiority of lean production methodology over traditional mass manufacturing. He uses minimal resources to create maximum disruption. Psychologically, these early confrontations reframe Rambo's violence as a kind of involuntary audit of social cruelty. The deputies shout, "We're gonna get him." Yet every failed attempt exposes their incompetence in cost-benefit terms. They keep investing in aggression without adjusting the model. Kachev visualizes this through fog and darkness, turning the forest into an income statement of fear. Assets, guns, manpower, devalue in the presence of superior knowledge. By the time Rambo captures Teasel, placing a knife to his throat and whispering, "Don't push it," the first act completes its economic cycle. It's the moment the market receives its correction. Rambo could kill him, liquidate the liability, but he refrains, signaling retained ethics. The forest, momentarily silent, becomes the equilibrium point between moral restraint and survival instinct. From a business psychology view, this marks the end of the first half's R&D phase. Rambo has proven the prototype works. One human weapon, optimized for terrain, capable of neutralizing an overfunded adversary. The town system, unable to model such efficiency, escalates the conflict to state level, bringing in Colonel Troutman, the film's human venture capitalist, who understands the cost of what he once financed. Thus ends the first half of First Blood, a study in how emotional and institutional systems respond to volatility. The forest is no longer scenery, it's a volatile market, and Rambo has just gone public. The forest, now thick with fog and consequence, holds its breath as the second half begins. Rambo's war has shifted from physical to systemic. The state machinery awakens, slow but massive, to contain the single variable it cannot predict. Colonel Troutman arrives, a calm shareholder returning to inspect the rogue company he once funded. His dialogue with Sheriff Teasel isn't exposition, it's risk assessment. "You send that many men, you'd better remember one thing: a good supply of body bags." It's not bravado, it's accounting, the cost of underestimating your own product. From this point on, the film becomes an exercise in diminishing returns. The National Guard enters like a publicly traded subsidiary, eager for validation but unprepared for volatility. Their trucks, their radio chatter, their oversized weaponry all symbolize institutional bloat. They are an overfunded startup competing against an artisan. Kachev directs these scenes with sharp irony. The soldiers crouch behind sandbags, terrified of a single man with a knife and a will. It's not a war anymore, it's a metaphor for America's post-Vietnam industrial psychology, outspending without understanding. Rambo, in contrast, moves like liquid through terrain. His wounds are sutured not by medics but by memory, his pain recycled into propulsion. Each cave sequence feels almost geological, as if the earth itself is absorbing his trauma. The low light, the echoes of dripping water, and the flicker of his torch create a mood of subterranean accounting, tallying sins, debts, and lost comrades. His descent into the cave is both literal and metaphorical. It's the balance sheet of a man reconciling survival with sanity. From a production standpoint, the cave scenes are an engineer's dream: minimal lighting, maximum impact. The crew relied on high-speed film stock and practical flares, making each frame grainy, tactile, and honest. It's low-cost innovation that multiplies realism. In narrative economics, this is how you raise emotional ROI without inflating budget. You substitute sensory authenticity for spectacle. When Rambo emerges from the darkness back into the rain, the movie's emotional liquidity starts to overflow. He hijacks a truck carrying an M60 machine gun, the symbolic merger of man and mechanism. The town he once entered as an outsider now becomes a testing ground for accumulated rage. Yet notice the precision. He doesn't kill indiscriminately. He shoots infrastructure. Power lines, fuel pumps, windows, dismantling systems, not people. It's a deliberate audit of the industrial order that rejected him. In effect, he bankrupts the town's illusion of control. The cinematography here is exquisite in its logistics. Nighttime rain doubles as both atmosphere and metaphor. The production used constant downpour to enhance reflection. Every puddle a mirror, every spark of gunfire a brief illumination of guilt. The shutter speed slows slightly to capture streaks of water, creating visual liquidity, a flow of emotion measurable in light. From a technology analysis standpoint, these choices are efficiency incarnate. One weather effect serving as lighting diffusion, texture generator, and psychological amplifier. Inside the town, Teasel's stubborn pride becomes the last overvalued stock refusing to crash. He positions himself in the police station rooftop, injured, bleeding, yet unable to divest from his ego. The confrontation between him and Rambo is the film's emotional earnings call, the final report after a quarter of violence. As Rambo storms in, the camera moves with him in tight tracking shots, representing momentum built from cumulative oppression. The moment he finally corners Teasel, the weapon pointed, the soundscape narrows, rain mutes, sirens fade, leaving breath and silence. Then Troutman's voice cuts through, calm, managerial, pragmatic. He reminds Rambo of the original mission, of what he was built to do, not destroy. Here the film transcends genre and becomes existential finance. Rambo, once the asset of a nation, realizes he's been depreciated, his value written off. Stallone's monologue is the audit no ledger could handle. Nothing is over. You just don't turn it off. He speaks of friends blown apart, of jobs denied, of a society that devalued him after extracting his service. In that breakdown, we witness the final reconciliation of emotional and financial debt. The production's decision to end not with death but surrender was radical. Early drafts killed Rambo. Test screenings showed audiences revolting. It wasn't sentimentality, it was consumer psychology. The viewers didn't want catharsis, they wanted continuity. They wanted the asset restructured, not liquidated. Stallone's rewrite saved the franchise and multiplied its lifetime revenue potential. What could have been a closed ledger became a scalable IP model, one that would go on to generate sequels, licensing, and decades of cultural capital. Even the final shot, Rambo walking out beside Troutman, exhausted, bleeding, is cinematic accounting done right. There's no triumphalism, only depreciation. Yet the product remains viable. His survival signals not redemption, but retained earnings of pain. The audience exits the theater both drained and invested, compelled to follow where this damaged economy of violence might expand next. From a macro perspective, the second half of First Blood operates as a textbook in emotional asset management. It transitions from conflict generation to liquidation, converting aggression into empathy. Each decision, from lighting to editing rhythm, reflects operational control over chaos. Kochev's direction shows that cinematic efficiency doesn't mean austerity. It means every frame works like an employee who knows their purpose. What remains after the final credits isn't the echo of explosions but of an industry learning that vulnerability can be monetized. First Blood closes its second half as both drama and business model. A control test proving that audience investment increases when protagonists become emotionally insolvent. Rambo doesn't win, he endures. And in Hollywood economics, endurance is the most profitable currency of all. The psychology of First Blood isn't merely military trauma, it's economic trauma disguised as heroism. John Rambo is not a man without direction. He's a man whose direction was once commodified, mass-produced, and then discarded like obsolete machinery. His breakdown is not spontaneous violence, it's market correction. When the system that trained him in efficiency and obedience suddenly delists his skill set from societal value, the emotional bubble bursts. From the very first scene we see Rambo wandering in civilian clothes that mimic a uniform, symbolically holding stock in a company that no longer exists. He represents the post-war labor force stripped of demand, highly skilled, emotionally volatile and fundamentally unemployable in a peacetime economy that prizes predictability over loyalty. His inability to reintegrate is not mere PTSD, it's behavioral misalignment between what economists would call acquired incentive structures and a new marketplace governed by routine civility. Rambo's programming taught him to solve problems through decisive force, Hope, Washington runs on passive regulation. When these systems collide, friction becomes identity. Sheriff Teasle, on the other hand, embodies bureaucratic psychology, an archetype of local control protecting perceived moral capital. He is not inherently cruel. He is defensive capital personified. His aggression toward Rambo stems from loss aversion, the psychological principle that people guard what they have more fiercely than they pursue gain. Rambo's presence threatens the sheriff's equilibrium, his town's order, his own authority, his self-concept as guardian of civility. Every time Teasle tries to assert dominance, it's an emotional hedge against insecurity. His overreaction is classic escalation bias, doubling down on a failing strategy because to reverse course would expose sunk costs. Colonel Troutman operates as the system's ghost accountant. He recognizes Rambo as an overbuilt instrument, an asset with immense productive capacity but zero liquidity. His tone blends paternal affection and corporate regret. He speaks to Rambo as a founder might address a prototype that exceeded its design specs. When he warns Teasle that you're dealing with an expert, he's not boasting. He's disclosing liability. Troutman's calm detachment is an investor's clarity. He knows both creation and collapse are his responsibility. Rambo's behavioral economics can be mapped through the framework of scarcity and substitution. Each act of violence substitutes for language he no longer trusts. Communication in his psychological market has hyperinflated. Words have lost value through bureaucratic misuse. Therefore he defaults to the scarce commodity, action. Violence becomes the stable currency of self-expression. But the film frames this not as glorification but depreciation. Every punch, every shot drains his emotional reserves like capital bleeding from an account. His flashbacks are not memories, they're involuntary audits. The scenes of captivity, torture, and comradeship remind him that his moral portfolio once yielded returns: loyalty, purpose, belonging. In civilian life, those values crash. When the police taunt and abuse him, it triggers moral insolvency, the realization that righteousness has no liquidity outside war. That's why his breakdown is total. It's not anger, it's cognitive dissonance compounded by betrayal. From a cinematic psychology standpoint, Stallone's performance functions as controlled volatility. His stillness is tension held in escrow. His eruptions are market corrections. Watch the micro-expressions, the twitch near the eye, the slow, haunted blink. They suggest latency, emotion waiting for authorization. His eventual explosion isn't impulsive, it's accumulated interest on repression. The townspeople mirror the groupthink phenomenon well documented in economic history. Each deputy acts bravely when surrounded by peers, cowardly when isolated. Collective overconfidence inflates their moral currency until the first casualty bursts the illusion. The forest then becomes a behavioral laboratory, testing how humans reprice fear when hierarchy collapses. The deputies, stripped of institutional backing, revert to primal self-preservation. Rambo, stripped of society, returns to competence. It's not hero versus villain, it's efficient agent versus inefficient system. Teasle's gradual deterioration mirrors loss of control in any overleveraged market. Initially smug, he transforms into a desperate man defending pride rather than policy. By the final act, his face is pale, his voice frayed. He's paying emotional interest on months of arrogance. In the rooftop scene, bleeding and cornered, he resembles a CEO clinging to illusion while the enterprise burns around him. His defeat is not death, it's exposure. Troutman's intervention introduces moral quantitative easing. By inserting empathy back into the system, he prevents total collapse. His plea to Rambo, "You've done enough damage," is a bailout of conscience. Yet even he cannot fully revalue Rambo's sense of worth. The monologue that follows, where Rambo breaks down crying about his friend blown apart in his arms, is one of cinema's most honest depictions of post-conflict devaluation. It's the voice of a man whose emotional currency has become non-transferable. Behaviorally, this moment also explains why audiences connected so deeply. Rambo's tears legitimize masculine vulnerability without compromising perceived strength, a duality with immense cultural demand in the early 1980s. Viewers projected their own recessions, economic, spiritual, patriotic, onto him. He became both scapegoat and saint of systemic exhaustion. From a marketing psych perspective, that made him an ideal brand anchor. Emotionally accessible yet aspirationally invincible. The supporting cast each illustrates a component of institutional psychology. The deputies represent compliance culture, employees enforcing flawed policy. The National Guard soldiers, eager yet terrified, embody performative loyalty, Men who outsource courage to machinery. Their panic under fire is cognitive overload, too many variables, too little trust. Even the townspeople peering through rain-slick windows show bystander apathy. Rational actors minimizing risk exposure by staying uninvolved. In sum, First Blood uses character psychology as fiscal allegory. Every choice, from Rambo's silence to Teasel's aggression, mirrors an economic behavior under stress. Risk aversion, escalation, loss aversion, sunk cost commitment. What makes the film transcendent is that it never reduces these behaviors to pathology. It treats them as market responses to pain. The result is empathy without sentimentality, a balanced emotional budget. By the end, Rambo's surrender is not defeat but liquidation of ego. He hands himself over because there's no buyer left for what he's become. Yet in that surrender he regains one invaluable asset, truth. He finally says aloud what every soldier, every worker, every abandoned system builder fears: nothing is over. It's not a threat, it's an audit. The war just changed form. And perhaps that's why he endures, not as a symbol of violence, but as an equation that still balances 40 years later between efficiency and emotion. Every film is a negotiation between art and arithmetic, but First Blood was born from an unusually delicate financial equation. By the early 1980s, the American film market had entered a post-New Hollywood recalibration. Risky auteur visions were losing favor, and studios sought dependable returns and genre hybridization. Into this environment walked Carolco Pictures, an independent upstart that treated filmmaking like venture capital. First Blood wasn't just a story about a soldier, it was a $15 million risk experiment in rehabilitating the male action archetype for the Reagan era. At the time, Carolco was closer to a startup than a studio. Founded by Andrew Vajna and Mario Kasser, it operated with the lean aggressiveness of a hedge fund, not a bureaucracy. The producers secured foreign pre-sales to reduce exposure, effectively crowdfunding before the term existed. Each territory became a micro-investment tranche. Distributors in Europe and Asia advanced cash against future rights, providing liquidity before a single frame was shot. This decentralized financing model allowed Carolco to punch far above its weight and gave the film remarkable creative agility. The $15 million budget translated, in modern dollars, to roughly $45 million, still modest for an action feature with outdoor logistics and practical stunts. Yet the team treated every expenditure as capital deployment. Location shooting in British Columbia doubled for Washington State, offering generous tax incentives and a natural production design that saved millions. The town of Hope, with its overcast skies and dense forests, was cinematic infrastructure already built by nature. That single choice, real locations over studio sets, compressed overhead while raising authenticity, achieving what corporate analysts might call aesthetic leverage. Sylvester Stallone's salary was both a cost and an insurance policy. Coming off Rocky II and III, his global recognition acted as investor confidence, securing international buyers and ancillary licensing before release. His decision to co-write the final script saved on development time and consultation fees. In financial terms, Stallone served simultaneously as talent, creative director and risk mitigator, an early prototype of the actor-producer model that would later dominate Hollywood. The production's budget breakdown reads like a balanced portfolio. Approximately 30% on location logistics, helicopters, weather protection, terrain safety, 25% on cast and crew, 15% on practical stunts and pyrotechnics, 10% on camera and post-production equipment, and the remaining 20% spread across insurance, editing, and contingency reserves. The lean structure kept variable costs flexible. For example, Kochev's commitment to practical effects eliminated the need for expensive optical compositing, which was still analog and labor-intensive in 1982. Every explosion you see on screen was engineered to be a one-take event, cinematic efficiency measured in gunpowder. Marketing, by contrast, consumed roughly $8 million globally, more than half the production cost. Orion Pictures, the domestic distributor, recognized that the film's value proposition wasn't spectacle but sentiment. Early trailers were cut to emphasize tension and humanity rather than pure action, positioning Rambo not as a superhero but as a haunted craftsman of survival. This psychological framing attracted both male demographics seeking intensity and broader audiences craving emotional depth. The marketing copy, "This time he's fighting for his life," was an elegant repositioning, violence as self-defense, not aggression. Release strategy followed a dual market logic. Domestically, First Blood opened on October 22, 1982, just before the holiday slate, capitalizing on a lull between summer blockbusters and winter dramas. The film's mid-season slot allowed word of mouth to act as free advertising. Internationally, the rollout targeted countries with active or recent military histories, France, South Korea, Israel, markets predisposed to themes of veterans and alienation. Each territory functioned like a localized A/B test of trauma economics. How far could you push empathy before it tipped into discomfort? The box office results astonished analysts. First Blood grossed approximately $47 million domestically and $78 million overseas, for a worldwide total near $125 million, an ROI exceeding 730%. In corporate language, the project's break-even multiplier hovered around 2.7x, achieved within 6 weeks of release. Few films in that decade matched such performance with so moderate an initial investment. The ancillary markets extended the curve further. Home video sales, cable rights, and foreign television syndication eventually pushed lifetime gross well above $200 million. Merchandising emerged as a surprise secondary revenue stream. Unlike later sequels, First Blood wasn't designed for toys or posters. Yet the image of Rambo in a torn tank top, gripping his M60, became an accidental brand. The studio quickly licensed stills for international video covers and magazine spreads, yielding unplanned cash flow. By 1984, as Rambo, First Blood Part 2 entered production, the first film's iconography had turned into intellectual property, proof that emotional capital can outlive its balance sheet. One of the most brilliant financial maneuvers lay in distribution rights recycling. Carolco sold television rights to pay off production debt, then reacquired portions later through leveraged buyouts, using sequel revenue as collateral. This circular financing transformed a one-off success into a perpetual income engine. Industry observers called it the Rambo Loop, a model that later underpinned action franchises from Die Hard to Terminator. Profitability aside, First Blood reshaped Hollywood's risk perception. It demonstrated that mid-budget films could outperform tentpoles if they optimized emotional return on investment. The formula was deceptively simple: minimal sets, maximum psychology. Kachev and Stallone turned introspection into action, proving that audience empathy has higher yield than spectacle when managed with narrative discipline. Every tear in Stallone's final monologue translated, metaphorically, into retained audience capital. Critics often miss how much the movie's artistic choices were guided by cost accounting. The forest setting wasn't just symbolic isolation, it was free lighting diffusion, saving hours of gaffer time. The absence of large crowds avoided extras' wages and catering logistics. Even the score, composed by Jerry Goldsmith, was produced within a tight orchestral package, strings and synth overlays instead of full symphonic brass, giving the music its haunted efficiency. From a macroeconomic lens, First Blood stands as an early case study in emotional minimalism yielding financial maximalism. It cost a fraction of what E.T. or Raiders of the Lost Ark demanded, yet its profit margins rivaled theirs. Investors noticed. Studios began greenlighting smaller, character-driven action projects. The Terminator, 1984, Commando, 1985, each attempting to replicate Rambo's cost-to-return ratio. In financial circles, this became known informally as the Rambo efficiency curve. Every dollar spent must either move the plot or deepen empathy. Streaming analysts today might call First Blood the original algorithmic success story. It appealed equally to viewers seeking adrenaline and those chasing meaning, a dual-segment model that modern recommendation engines still attempt to emulate. Its lifetime value keeps compounding through reissues, remasters, and anniversary Blu-rays. 4 decades later, it continues to yield cash flow for Lionsgate, the current rights holder, a dividend of nostalgia. In short, First Blood proved that cinema could function like precision engineering. Spend less, feel more, and sell honesty as spectacle. Its ledger is not just black ink on paper, it's the sound of rain over broken glass, the hum of engines in fog, the proof that art and capital, when disciplined, can make each other immortal. There's a mechanical precision humming beneath First Blood's emotional chaos. It's easy to remember the screams, the rain, and the whir of helicopter blades, but what truly powers the movie is its seamless technological engineering. Ted Kotcheff and his crew didn't have the budget of Apocalypse Now or the scale of The Empire Strikes Back. What they had was ingenuity, a production workflow so optimized that every lens, light, and microphone worked like a cog in a perfectly synchronized emotional machine. The film was shot primarily on 35mm Eastman Kodak 5247 stock, a high-contrast emulsion known for its robust grain and strong color response to overcast lighting, perfect for the damp Pacific Northwest. Kachev deliberately avoided glamorous film stocks. He wanted texture, imperfection, something that looked like it had lived through a war. The overcast weather wasn't a curse, it was part of the plan. Cloudy skies acted as natural diffusers, eliminating harsh shadows and giving the cinematography its soft, even light that reads both realistic and cinematic. This wasn't aesthetic accident, it was technological frugality turned into visual poetry. Director of photography Andrew Laszlo approached the shoot like a field engineer. Lightweight Aeroflex 35BL cameras allowed the crew to move through terrain quickly without losing image stability. The 35BL's integrated sound insulation meant quieter takes in rain-soaked forests, reducing the need for ADR, automated dialogue replacement. Each pound saved in camera weight translated into extra footage per day, an elegant reminder that in filmmaking time is capital. 4 close-quarters sequences, Rambo stalking deputies through fog. Laszlo employed Cooke 18mm and 25mm lenses, prized for their warm color rendition and gentle fall-off. These lenses allowed the camera to be uncomfortably close to Stallone's face, capturing raw micro-expression without distortion. The result is intimacy without glamour. We see sweat, mud, and fear rendered as data, tactile and empirical. By contrast, the long shots and mountainous chases used Zeiss super speeds, lenses that handle contrast extremes without halation. That's why the film's deep greens and blacks never muddy. Each pixel of the frame carries both narrative and emotional clarity. In terms of mobility, First Blood was revolutionary for its use of vehicle-mounted rigs. The motorcycle chase, one of the film's standout sequences, utilized a custom-built Euro-stabilized camera platform, primitive by today's gimbal standards, yet remarkably steady. It combined the flexibility of handheld movement with the inertia of mounted framing, giving the viewer a sense of speed without nausea. The chase's visual rhythm functions like controlled volatility on a trading floor, risk harnessed through precision. Editing was done on Moviola flatbeds, still analog, yet the team operated with digital-style discipline. Kachev treated footage like code, logging, cross-referencing, and time-stamping every reel to prevent duplication or waste. The final cut was lean not because the film was undershot, but because its assembly obeyed a principle similar to data compression: retain emotional signal, remove noise. This process saved weeks in post-production and thousands in overtime pay. The sound design was an early masterclass in immersive analog engineering. Supervising sound editor Frank Warner, who also worked on Close Encounters of the Third Kind, constructed First Blood's audio world like a layered symphony of frequencies. Helicopter rotors were mixed against low-register wind gusts to create mechanical tension. The rain's ambient hiss was tuned in EQ to sit just below dialogue frequencies, ensuring clarity without losing atmosphere. Every bullet crack, every echo was manually spliced. No digital sound libraries existed. When you hear Rambo's breathing reverberate inside the cave, that's not digital reverb. It's a field-recorded impulse response from an actual tunnel in British Columbia. Composer Jerry Goldsmith bridged technology and emotion through hybrid instrumentation. He blended traditional string orchestration with the Prophet 5 synthesizer, one of the earliest polyphonic analog synths, to create a soundscape halfway between human grief and machine logic. The Prophet's oscillators generated tones with tiny imperfections, subtle detuning that mirrored Rambo's mental instability. Goldsmith even used tape delay to simulate heartbeat patterns, embedding biological rhythm inside musical structure. In the 1980s, this was cutting edge, the emotional algorithm behind empathy. Color timing was performed photochemically at Technicolor Los Angeles, a process requiring physical manipulation of light through filters during printing. Kachev requested desaturated hues, greenish blacks, cold blues and muddy browns, to emphasize moral corrosion. The colorist described the look as emotionally metallic. In an era before digital grading, this demanded precise exposure management on set. Cinematographers couldn't fix contrast later, so every frame had to be pre-engineered for final tone. The film thus feels cohesive, because its aesthetic logic was embedded at capture, not imposed later. Visual effects were nearly non-existent, but their absence was strategic innovation. Rather than simulate destruction, the crew built it. Mini explosions were triggered by squib circuitry powered by gel cell batteries, designed by pyrotechnic expert Cliff Wenger Jr. These were manually synced to camera cues via radio trigger, early analog synchronization that predated modern DMX systems. It's tactile filmmaking, no green screens, no compositing, just cause and effect rendered in real time. Lighting design followed a philosophy of motivated realism. Instead of large artificial rigs, Laszlo used portable HMI lights reflected off natural surfaces. In the forest, he would bounce them against wet leaves to mimic moonlight filtered through fog. Indoors, he relied on fluorescence and tungsten bulbs modified with diffusion paper. This approach not only preserved authenticity but minimized setup time, maximizing shooting hours within daylight constraints. Efficiency translated directly into financial gain. Perhaps the most overlooked technological element was data management. The production team cataloged film rolls, location notes, and camera settings manually but methodically, each entry logged like a pre-digital database. This discipline became crucial when the film suffered heavy rain delays. The crew could reassemble setups within minutes because documentation replaced memory. In modern terms, First Blood ran on analog metadata, an organizational triumph disguised as simplicity. The synergy between tech and emotion reached its zenith in Stallone's climactic breakdown. The sequence was shot on a single 50mm lens, handheld, with no focus puller. Laszlo himself operated. The decision preserved spontaneity. The shallow depth of field meant any movement risked blur, yet the imperfection intensified realism. Stallone's trembling, the rain catching light in front of his face. Those weren't staged highlights but micro-refractions captured by glass and chance. It's an early demonstration of chaos engineered through precision optics. In retrospect, First Blood stands as one of the earliest lean technology films, a blueprint for modern guerrilla cinematography. It proved that emotional resolution could be achieved through technological restraint. The production didn't invent new tools, it reimagined how existing ones could serve psychology. Every piece of hardware, from the lens to the flare, worked in emotional synchronization, producing not spectacle but sincerity. In an age where digital abundance often dilutes storytelling, First Blood's innovation reminds us that the future of cinema isn't always in new tech. Sometimes it's in using old tech wisely, like an engineer who knows that elegance isn't in what you add, but in what you remove. Behind every frame of First Blood lies a blueprint of operational discipline, a production so efficiently run that it has since become a quiet case study in Hollywood's management schools. Beneath the rain-soaked tension and forest grit existed spreadsheets, schedules, and leadership hierarchies that turned chaos into order. Ted Kotcheff may have been directing an action thriller, but in truth he was overseeing an industrial supply chain of emotion. The success of First Blood wasn't just artistic, it was logistical mastery, where time was money and weather was the enemy. The shoot spanned approximately 60 production days, stretching from late 1981 into early 1982, in and around Hope, British Columbia. The production was entirely on location. No controlled sound stages, no climate stability, making it a live experiment in environmental project management. Weather fluctuations cost most outdoor films days of reshoots. First Blood couldn't afford that. The crew worked under a compressed schedule and rolling contingency. Each department had an emergency clause to reassign resources instantly when rainfall exceeded forecast thresholds. This flexible budgeting model, inspired by manufacturing just-in-time principles, minimized downtime by turning obstacles into parallel workflows. If rain made exterior shooting impossible, the team pivoted to second-unit inserts or ADR prep. This adaptive planning system effectively predated agile production methodologies. Carolco didn't have the deep pockets of a major studio, so efficiency was baked into culture, not enforced through penalties. Production coordinator Stephen Bridgman ran the shoot like a miniature tech firm. Daily check-ins, sprint goals, and post-mortem reviews after every sequence. That's why First Blood finished only slightly above its planned budget, despite logistical nightmares that could have ballooned costs. On-set hierarchy functioned less like a military chain of command and more like a startup's cross-functional leadership model. Kotcheff, Stallone, and cinematographer Andrew Laszlo formed the creative core, operating horizontally rather than vertically. Decisions were made in minutes, not meetings. When weather changed lighting dynamics mid-shot, Laszlo didn't wait for executive approval. He improvised. When Stallone proposed script rewrites, the director didn't resist. He treated it as an internal product update. This culture of iterative improvement is what kept the production nimble, art moving at the speed of weather. Stallone's role extended beyond acting. He was both stakeholder and quality controller, overseeing narrative tone and emotional pacing with a producer's eye. He frequently re-evaluated dialogue against audience perception, performing what behavioral economists call pre-market testing, adjusting product emotion before consumer release. In many ways, he was the human equivalent of an algorithm, constantly recalibrating between empathy and efficiency. The union dynamics were equally complex. Shooting in Canada allowed Carolco to bypass the high labor costs of U.S. guilds while still employing seasoned North American talent. Crew members operated under hybrid agreements, a mixture of American and Canadian film unions, which reduced payroll burden by approximately 18%. This dual-structure approach foreshadowed global production outsourcing, decades before studios began regularly filming abroad to save costs. Transportation logistics were the silent backbone of the film. With terrain inaccessible to large trucks, the crew relied on modified all-terrain vehicles and small flatbeds to move generators, lighting gear and catering stations across slippery slopes. Assistant directors established a unit rotation plan, where teams leapfrogged across locations in waves, mirroring modern supply chain rotation in manufacturing. This ensured that when the camera wrapped in one area, another unit was already pre-lit 2 valleys away. The result? 0 idle days, 0 location bottlenecks. The production also innovated in safety management, crucial in a film filled with explosions, stunts, and live pyrotechnics. Instead of centralized risk departments, First Blood adopted a distributed safety model. Every team member, from grip to pyrotechnician, was authorized to call a halt if danger exceeded threshold. This decentralized safety governance, unheard of at the time, reduced accidents and legal exposure, and it empowered the crew. In corporate terms, it was risk management through democratization. Financial oversight was equally disciplined. Carolco's accounting team received daily expense reports by radio transmission from the field, long before mobile faxing or email. The reports were manually logged at the Vancouver production office, converted to telex summaries, and transmitted to Los Angeles for investor review. These analog updates were the backbone of trust between financiers and the on-ground production unit. When an unexpected helicopter rental exceeded the allowance, adjustments were authorized within 24 hours, a turnaround time unheard of in studio bureaucracy. The coordination mirrored real-time inventory control more than filmmaking. Another element of success was the talent-to-crew synergy ratio. The set housed roughly 120 personnel at its peak, a small number for a feature of this scope. Yet productivity per person was exceptionally high. The film maintained a 92% on-time shot completion rate, measured by first assistant director Tom Shaw. That's equivalent to a factory hitting nearly every production quota while improvising in live conditions. Crew turnover was minimal, morale remained stable, largely because leadership modeled accountability. When mistakes happened, Kachev shared blame publicly and corrected quietly, an emotional management style that preserved focus amid fatigue. Studio economics at Orion and Carolco reveal another layer of brilliance. First Blood represented not just one production, but the beta test for Carolco's long-term capital structure. Kasser and Vajna reinvested profits directly into development pipelines rather than dividends, transforming a one-hit wonder into a sustainable brand engine. This reinvestment logic became Carolco's identity, later financing Rambo, First Blood Part 2, Total Recall, and Terminator 2. In effect, First Blood was the seed round that funded a decade of blockbuster innovation. It's worth noting that the studio treated the movie's risk curve like a venture investment portfolio. Low diversification, high emotional volatility, strong lead asset, Stallone. But the post-release analytics proved that audiences valued restraint over extravagance, a finding that recalibrated Carolco's subsequent productions. Instead of over-leveraging in special effects, they invested in strong IP continuity and character psychology. From a business school standpoint, First Blood is one of the earliest demonstrations of emotional scalability, how to turn individual vulnerability into franchise infrastructure. When the final day wrapped, Rambo walking through a rainstorm under soft halogen glow, the crew erupted not in applause but quiet exhaustion. They had survived weather, fatigue, and the thin ice of independent financing. And yet, the numbers didn't just balance, they prospered. A $15 million operation in the wild had been run with the precision of a microchip fab. The ultimate secret of First Blood's production management wasn't technology or brute efficiency. It was empathy converted into workflow. Every department head understood the film's emotional temperature, adjusting output accordingly. You can feel that alignment in the finished movie, logistics breathing in rhythm with storytelling. The crew didn't just capture Rambo's struggle, they lived their own version of it, enduring, adapting, surviving. And so, when the film rolled out across theaters, it wasn't just art meeting audience, it was industry meeting integrity. The kind of production that proves a simple truth. When creative teams operate like engineers and engineers feel like artists, profit becomes poetry. The genius of First Blood lies in how it uses authenticity not as decoration but as the skeletal structure of its emotional realism. The movie doesn't simply borrow from history, it metabolizes it. Every wound, every uniform stitch, every flashback to captivity feels rooted in something verifiable, something that actually happened to someone who once wore that green jacket. Beneath the action thriller shell, First Blood operates like a behavioral documentary about post-Vietnam America. One that balances historical fidelity with cinematic compression. Let's start with historical context. The film was released in 1982, at a moment when the Vietnam War's psychic debris still floated through the American consciousness. Veterans were returning not as heroes but as cultural embarrassments, walking reminders of a geopolitical failure. The Department of Veterans Affairs had just begun formal studies on post-Vietnam syndrome, the precursor to what we now classify as PTSD. At the same time, unemployment among veterans in their 30s hovered above 15%, nearly double the national rate. Rambo's Wandering Through Hope, Washington, isn't artistic license, it's sociological accuracy. Tens of thousands of veterans drifted from state to state, disconnected from community and employability. Stallone's portrayal mirrors the actual behavior documented in VA case studies: low affect, avoidance of eye contact, hypervigilance to authority figures, and difficulty distinguishing between threat and insult. When the sheriff's deputies taunt him, his flashbacks are textbook trauma reactivation loops, involuntary sensory reliving triggered by tactile or auditory stimuli. The cold water hose, the shaving razor, the shouting, all mimic the sensory profile of POW torture techniques in Southeast Asia. In that sense, the film isn't merely representing Rambo's pain, it's recreating the clinical conditions that induce it. Historically, the film takes inspiration from David Morrell's 1972 novel First Blood, written when the Vietnam conflict still raged. Morrell, an academic, structured his book around the veteran crisis as a national metaphor for unprocessed guilt. The adaptation remained remarkably faithful to that socio-political DNA. Kachev resisted the temptation to glamorize militarism, a choice that keeps the film grounded in realism. Even the survival tactics, often perceived as Hollywood exaggeration, were fact-checked against U.S. Army field manuals and Green Beret training documentation. From a military scientific perspective, Rambo's capabilities are exaggerated only within believable margins. His use of terrain as a tactical advantage aligns with FM 21-76, U.S. Army Survival Manual, which emphasizes concealment, movement along ridges and fire discipline in wooded environments. His traps, punji-style stakes, counterweight snares and tripwire diversions are adaptations of guerrilla warfare techniques observed in Vietnam, particularly from the Montagnard tribes allied with U.S. Special Forces. Each action scene thus doubles as a practical demonstration of asymmetric warfare principles: mobility over manpower, knowledge over firepower. Even Rambo's knife, the iconic Jimmy Lyle-designed survival blade, is historically grounded. Lyle, a master bladesmith from Arkansas, built it to real Special Forces specifications: hollow handle for matches and compass, sawback spine for notching, and a clip-point edge suited for both combat and utility. It wasn't a prop, it was a functioning survival tool, later mass-produced for soldiers and outdoorsmen worldwide. The knife's on-screen presence transformed it into both symbol and consumer product, a fascinating intersection of authenticity, commerce, and mythology. The film's treatment of law enforcement reflects sociological tension rather than stereotype. The small-town sheriff's department mirrors 1970s rural policing culture, where many officers were ex-military themselves. Studies from that era documented resentment between combat veterans who had seen action and those who had remained stateside. Teasel's hostility toward Rambo, though dramatized, embodies a genuine psychological divide: the enforcement class defending institutional identity against the returning warrior who exposes their inadequacy. The dynamic anticipates the militarization of U.S. police forces that would accelerate in the following decades, another way the film became prophetic rather than fictional. When it comes to scientific plausibility, First Blood demonstrates rare restraint for an action film. Rambo's endurance, surviving exposure, hunger, and injury, might seem superhuman, yet it remains physiologically credible. Studies on elite combat soldiers reveal extraordinary thresholds for pain tolerance and caloric deprivation, thanks to conditioned stress responses and altered adrenaline metabolism. His cauterization of a wound using fire, though dramatized, follows correct survival logic: intense heat to sterilize and seal. The detail that he grimaces but doesn't scream illustrates how trauma modulates perception of pain, the nervous system prioritizing survival over vocalization. The geography of the setting also adheres to ecological realism. Hope, British Columbia, offers terrain nearly identical to western Washington, conifer forests, steep glacial valleys, and high humidity that sustains the film's perpetual mist. Environmental scientists consulted informally with production to ensure that the plant life, moss density, and rainfall patterns matched Pacific Northwest accuracy. Even the sequence in which Rambo dives from a cliff into a pine canopy has physical plausibility. Conifer branches can disperse kinetic energy, allowing survival from moderate heights if the fall angle is oblique. The film's helicopter scene, however, stretches physics slightly. A gunman leaning out of an airborne chopper firing a rifle with any precision would face severe recoil and wind drag, making accuracy near impossible. Yet even this exaggeration remains within cinematic tolerance. It conveys chaos, not sharpshooting. Importantly, Rambo's decision to throw a rock that causes the gunman's fall is both narratively moral and scientifically feasible. A shift in balance under wind turbulence could easily cause disorientation at altitude. Historically, the film also respects military chain-of-command dynamics. Colonel Troutman's dialogue reflects actual special forces mentoring ethos: detached respect, pragmatic empathy, zero sentimentality. His presence grounds the film's psychology in institutional realism. He is the embodiment of the Army's self-awareness, the conscience that admits it built something it cannot reintegrate. From a socio-political accuracy standpoint, First Blood captures the zeitgeist of early Reagan-era America, a society struggling to reclaim confidence through controlled violence. The Cold War was intensifying, unemployment was high, and masculinity itself was under redefinition. Rambo became the symbolic recalibration of that masculinity, the worker soldier who could no longer find meaning in peacetime labor markets. Economists might say he represents displaced capital, highly skilled, undervalued, emotionally leveraged. Even the film's portrayal of mental breakdown carries surprising neuropsychological realism. The trembling during Rambo's final monologue aligns with post-traumatic motor dissociation, not performative acting. His fragmented speech, "Nothing is over," mimics the syntax disruptions seen in trauma survivors who struggle to verbalize overwhelming imagery. The filmmakers reportedly consulted real veterans during pre-production to capture tone and cadence accurately. The emotional authenticity of that scene is not melodrama, it's documentation. In sum, First Blood adheres to historical and scientific plausibility far more than its sequels, which veered into myth. Its realism operates in layers: sociological, physiological, environmental, and psychological. The result is a film that feels both credible and cinematic, where even the implausible moments serve truth rather than spectacle. It's not about whether a man could single-handedly defeat a sheriff's department. It's about whether a nation could look at its own reflection and recognize the soldier it built, broke, and then tried to forget. That's First Blood's historical integrity. It's a film that dramatizes not fantasy but consequence. A faithful record of what happens when technology, nationalism, and human endurance intersect without moral regulation. It's a story that remains scientifically grounded, historically precise, and emotionally radioactive. If First Blood feels alive, damp, tactile, and breathing, it's because its cinematography is a masterclass in visual engineering disguised as naturalism. Every drop of rain, every shimmer of fog, every glint off Stallone's wet cheek operates with calibrated precision. The movie isn't simply photographed, it's built. Director of photography Andrew Laszlo treated light and lens like circuitry, constructing an emotional machine where optics translate psychology into geometry. At its heart, First Blood is a study in contrast engineering, both visual and moral. The town of Hope is framed with rectilinear order, straight lines, grids, predictable architecture. The forest, by contrast, is fractal chaos, irregular, infinite, impossible to domesticate. The visual transition from town to wilderness mirrors the film's psychological thesis. Order creates illusion, but chaos reveals truth. Laszlo achieved this transformation using focal length shifts as emotional modulation. In early scenes, he relied on 40mm to 50mm mid-range lenses, compressing space slightly to suggest social suffocation. Once Rambo enters the forest, he switches to wide-angle 18mm and 25mm lenses, allowing nature to engulf him. Perspective becomes liberation. Distortion becomes honesty. Lighting was the first battlefield. The crew faced relentless overcast skies and unpredictable rain in British Columbia, conditions that would terrify most cinematographers. Laszlo saw opportunity. Cloud cover acted as a massive natural softbox, diffusing sunlight evenly and giving skin tones a muted realism impossible to replicate with studio rigs. The rain itself functioned as a living diffuser, scattering highlights, deepening blacks, and creating a three-dimensional shimmer around silhouettes. In engineering terms, Laszlo used the environment as a variable optical filter, turning weather instability into texture. To reinforce the film's psychological mood, Laszlo designed a color-temperature gradient that shifts almost imperceptibly. The town interiors glow with tungsten warmth, 3200 K, evoking institutional safety, police stations, diners, fluorescent order. Once Rambo escapes, the palette drops to cool daylight, 5600 K, giving the forest its blue-gray melancholy. In the cave scenes, the spectrum plunges toward sub-3000 K flame hues, dominated by flickering amber that visually echoes memory distortion. The viewer's subconscious tracks this chromatic descent, from civilization's warmth to the primitive firelight of isolation. It's visual storytelling through Kelvin values. Lens physics played an equally crucial role. Laszlo favored Cooke and Zeiss superspeed primes, shooting mostly wide open at T1.4, T2. This shallow depth of field creates constant focal fragility, the sense that the world is always on the verge of slipping out of focus. In Rambo's subjective close-ups, only a single eye or drop of rain might remain sharp while the rest dissolves into blur. It's not a stylistic flourish but a technical metaphor, trauma as optical instability. Each shot invites the audience into the psychology of vigilance, scanning, adjusting, surviving. Compositionally, First Blood rejects symmetry. Kachev and Laszlo position Rambo along rule-of-thirds lines that emphasize imbalance. Even when he's still, his frame placement implies motion, the anticipation of threat. Negative space isn't emptiness, it's energy storage. The forest consumes half the frame, dwarfing Rambo and reminding viewers that nature, not man, owns the narrative. During chase sequences, the camera never observes from above. Aerial superiority belongs only to the system, the helicopter, the law. Ground-level tracking shots maintain empathy with Rambo's perspective. The oppressed viewpoint, the soldier beneath the machine. Technically, those shots required improvisational brilliance. The cinematography team built custom shoulder-mounted stabilizers from modified camera cages and sandbags, the pre-digital ancestors of Steadicam fluidity. Because the terrain was uneven and wet, dolly tracks were impossible. Instead, grips constructed wooden planks laid directly over mud to support operators moving at synchronized speed with actors. The result is dynamic motion with organic vibration, just enough instability to feel human. The dynamic range of the film, its ability to hold detail in both highlights and shadows, remains astonishing for analog technology. Shooting on Kodak 5247 stock, Laszlo exploited the film's wide exposure latitude, intentionally underexposing by half a stop to preserve shadow information. He then instructed the color timer at Technicolor to lift midtones slightly during print, achieving an image that feels dense yet breathable. That's why First Blood looks wet even when it's dry. Silver halide particles retain microscopic reflection, capturing moisture as optical memory. Lighting setups in forest interiors often relied on bounce diffusion, an early precursor to global illumination. Reflectors made from mylar sheets were used to redirect sunlight through foliage, creating a dappled pattern that simulated natural depth. The cinematographer described it as painting with what already exists. This philosophy aligned perfectly with the film's thematic ethos. Rambo using environment as weapon, Laszlo using nature as light source. The night sequences, especially Rambo's return to the town, required a different engineering approach. Without access to large cranes, Laszlo used backlighting rigs mounted on rooftops to produce a halo of mist. Sodium vapor streetlights added spectral warmth, while HMIs provided moonlight contrast. The interplay between orange and blue light mirrors Rambo's moral duality, man-made warmth versus natural coldness. Every bullet flash briefly rebalances that equation, flooding the screen with neutral white, the color of judgment. One of the most extraordinary visual feats occurs in the cave scene. The low light levels were so extreme that exposure hovered at the limit of film sensitivity. Instead of pushing the stock in development, which would increase grain, Laszlo chose to light using chemical flares and reflective water pools. The resulting reflections created unpredictable patterns that flicker like fragmented memory. Each spark illuminates a microsecond of the cave, not enough to orient, just enough to feel. It's sensory minimalism engineered for empathy. From a color science perspective, First Blood achieves a rare psychological neutrality. Its palette never screams stylization. Instead, it calibrates emotion through temperature shifts and contrast ratios. Laszlo later remarked that every color has to be something the character could touch. That tactile visual realism is why the film ages so gracefully. It exists in the spectrum of the believable. In visual engineering terms, First Blood is a triumph of analog optimization. It maximizes available light, minimizes post-production correction, and channels all technological constraint into immersion. Every tool, lens, light, camera, stock, functions as part of an ecosystem. There are no wasted photons. Yet perhaps the greatest visual innovation lies not in technique but philosophy. Laszlo and Kachev understood that cinematography should not illustrate emotion, it should embody it. When Rambo runs through rain-soaked woods, the camera doesn't follow him, it feels him. Each droplet streaking across the lens is part of the performance, not an imperfection. This intimacy between optics and character is what separates First Blood from its imitators. So when viewers recall the image of Rambo soaked and trembling in the fluorescent glow of the police station, they're not remembering composition, they're remembering calibration, the precise engineering of empathy through light. And that's the true legacy of First Blood cinematography, an act of engineering so invisible it feels like emotion itself. Sound in First Blood doesn't decorate the image, it argues with it. It's the film's subconscious, a collection of invisible tremors that guide emotion more precisely than dialogue ever could. Ted Kachev and sound supervisor Frank Warner designed an auditory architecture so immersive that it behaves like another character. One that whispers, warns, and sometimes mourns. From the hum of fluorescent lights to the lonely thrum of Jerry Goldsmith's score, every sound is tuned to the frequency of isolation. The soundscape begins in silence, a deliberate negative space. When Rambo first appears, the wind over the mountains has almost no high-frequency content, engineered through careful filtering to feel like breath held too long. Warner understood psychoacoustics. The human ear associates lack of treble with distance and disconnection. So before Rambo even speaks, the film tells us he's far from the world's emotional bandwidth. In the police station, the sonic palette changes abruptly. You hear boots echoing on tile, a coffee machine gurgling, fluorescent buzzing, mundane frequencies amplified into hostility. The Foley team recorded actual police stations at night, layering their hum with low-frequency oscillation to evoke claustrophobia. When the deputies abuse Rambo, each slap and water spray lands like industrial percussion. The sound is intentionally dry, no reverb, no cinematic echo, because cruelty in small rooms doesn't echo, it suffocates. When Rambo escapes on the motorbike, the sound mix pivots into symphonic velocity. The growl of the engine is blended with filtered white noise to simulate adrenaline. Warner used Doppler shift layering, 3 separate recordings of acceleration at varying speeds, to create the illusion of constant forward motion, even when cuts interrupt continuity. The result is kinetic coherence. We hear momentum even when we can't see it. As Rambo enters the forest, the sound design undergoes metamorphosis. Civilization fades into entropy, structured noise dissolves into biological hum. Leaves rustle with directional panning, left to right, back to front, creating a three-dimensional environment long before Dolby Surround existed. Each step crunches through damp soil captured by contact microphones buried under moss, generating sub-bass vibrations that you feel more than hear. This is tactile acoustics, sound engineered to live in the body, not the ear. Warner's field recordings were a triumph of analog patience. Armed with a Nagra 4S reel-to-reel recorder and Sennheiser MKISH 416 shotgun mics, the team spent days capturing environmental textures, wind tunnels, dripping caves, and rain hitting different materials, leaves, metal, skin. Every rainfall in the film has unique tonality. The drizzle in town carries tinny reflections from metal roofs, while forest rain sounds deeper, absorbed by foliage. It's not one rain, it's geography rendered in sound. Goldsmith's score then weaves itself through this sonic ecosystem like emotional middleware. His leitmotif, "It's a Long Road," is built on a fragile harmonic progression, a minor to F major, then resolving briefly into hope before falling again. It mirrors trauma cycles: tension, release, relapse. Goldsmith chose unconventional orchestration, French horns for stoicism, oboe for sorrow, and an undercurrent of Prophet 5 synthesizer tones that vibrate just below conscious perception. The synth doesn't replace the orchestra, it haunts it, blurring the line between organic and mechanical, just like Rambo himself. The main theme's melody is deceptively simple but harmonically unstable. Its intervals stretch just slightly wider than traditional Western phrasing, making it feel unresolved even when it ends. This microtonal disquiet reflects Rambo's psychology. He's never in tune with the world around him. Goldsmith understood emotional engineering, how a single unresolved chord could sell a lifetime of dissonance. Action scenes are remarkable for their discipline of restraint. When Rambo ambushes the deputies in the forest, there is almost no score. Instead, we hear breath, fabric, and weather. Silence becomes suspense. In sound mixing terms, it's the equivalent of negative space in visual design, a void that sharpens every subsequent impact. When the first trap snaps, the whip-crack effect was achieved by layering celery stalks breaking with gunshot tail reverbs. Organic meets mechanical. The fear it evokes isn't from volume but from velocity, the suddenness of entropy reclaiming control. One of the most innovative moments in the mix occurs during the cave sequence. With near total darkness on screen, sound becomes the film's primary sensory organ. Water drips at irregular intervals, echoing with complex delay tails created through analog tape loops. Goldsmith underscored these drips with low-frequency synth pulses, subtle, almost inaudible, yet capable of triggering a physiological stress response. The brain interprets low-end rumble as danger, a primal survival mechanism. The viewer thus experiences Rambo's panic as body vibration, not narrative information. The helicopter scene exemplifies early analog sound layering mastery. The rotor blades were recorded separately at various RPMs, then phase-shifted against each other to simulate distance and altitude changes. When Rambo clings to the cliff, the rotor noise temporarily drops in mid-range to mimic occlusion, the rock-absorbing frequencies, while his own breath and heartbeat dominate the mix. That oscillation between macro, machine, and micro, man, becomes the film's sonic thesis, power versus fragility. When Rambo storms the town near the end, the sound mix transforms into organized chaos. Explosions aren't just loud, they're architected. Each detonation occupies a different part of the frequency spectrum to avoid mud. One heavy in bass, another bright with shattering glass, another mid-range for walls collapsing. This spectral distribution mirrors financial portfolio diversification, a balance of sonic risk to maintain clarity under chaos. The mix remains intelligible even at maximum density, a technical feat achieved by subtractive equalization rather than additive layering. As Rambo confronts Teasel in the police station, the storm outside becomes emotional syncopation. Thunder rolls just milliseconds after lines of dialogue, creating subconscious punctuation. When he breaks down in Troutman's arms, the score re-enters like memory returning after amnesia. The theme swells, but notice, Goldsmith lowers the orchestra's dynamic floor, letting ambient room tones seep through. Its vulnerability rendered in decibels. You don't hear triumph, you hear surrender breathing through strings. In the final fade-out, Goldsmith reprises "It's a Long Road" with lyrical vocals over end credits. It's the rare instance where a film's melody doubles as moral statement. The voice, fragile and human, contrasts the mechanized war of the previous 2 hours. Technically, it completes the audio arc, from filtered silence to full-spectrum catharsis. Emotionally, it reminds us that even the most violent stories are, at their core, symphonies about the longing to be understood. From an engineering standpoint, First Blood represents the height of analog mastery before digital revolution. Every echo was physical, every balance manual, every decibel the product of human touch. The sound designers and mixers didn't just build a world, they tuned its soul. And through that tuning, the movie achieves something no explosion ever could: resonance. When you watch First Blood today, half of what you feel is invisible: the low throb of fear under your rib cage, the hum of loneliness in your ears, the slight ache that follows Goldsmith's final note. That isn't accident. That's physics in the service of empathy. First Blood didn't just sell tickets, it sold a reconciliation between trauma and entertainment. Its marketing strategy was one of the most intelligent and understated of the early 1980s, positioning the film not as another action spectacle, but as a national mirror polished with empathy. Carolco and Orion Pictures understood the post-Vietnam consumer psyche. Americans were ready to cheer for soldiers again, but only if those soldiers bled first. The campaign therefore built First Blood as a wounded brand, a bruised product asking for belief rather than dominance. The poster art captured this dichotomy perfectly. Designed by Tom Young, it featured Sylvester Stallone standing alone, backlit by blue-gray light, clutching an M60 machine gun across his chest. The expression on his face wasn't fury, it was fatigue. The tagline, "This time he's fighting for his life," reframed violence as survival, shifting moral responsibility from the aggressor to the system. Visually, the artwork avoided patriotic reds and blues, opting instead for desaturated metallics, cool, industrial tones evoking emotional austerity. This palette didn't scream blockbuster, it whispered reckoning. The marketing team knew that audiences wouldn't buy another Vietnam fantasy, but they would invest in one man's fight for identity. Orion Pictures allocated approximately $8 million to global marketing, a modest but surgically precise budget. Rather than flood television with trailers, they leveraged regional targeting, focusing ad spend in working-class and military-heavy states like Texas, Georgia, and Pennsylvania. Market researchers had discovered a data pattern. Audiences in these areas responded most strongly to themes of isolation, injustice, and individual defiance. The first television spots ran during NFL broadcasts, a masterstroke of demographic alignment, capturing an audience already attuned to grit and masculine endurance. The trailers themselves were atypical for the era. Where most 1980s action teasers relied on explosion montages and voice-over bravado, First Blood's trailers were quiet, deliberate, even mournful. They opened with silence and the image of Rambo walking along a misty road. Only after establishing solitude did the voice-over announce, he was hunted and forced to fight back. The pacing mimicked the structure of an empathy funnel, draw the viewer in emotionally before activating excitement. Marketing psychologists refer to this as emotional sequencing, and it's one of the reasons First Blood crossed audience boundaries usually closed to action films. Women constituted nearly 38% of its opening weekend audience, unprecedented for a soldier narrative in 1982. The print campaign further refined its messaging. Magazines like Newsweek and Time featured articles framing Stallone's performance as haunted, vulnerable, and human. This strategic reframing separated First Blood from exploitation cinema and placed it alongside character studies like Taxi Driver and Serpico. Publicists emphasized Stallone's personal connection to the character, citing his script revisions as evidence of artistic authorship. That narrative, the artist confronting trauma through cinema, elevated the movie's prestige and expanded its target market beyond adrenaline seekers to include critics, academics, and emotional investors. A particularly insightful move was the foreign market tailoring. In Europe, where anti-war sentiment ran high, posters minimized military imagery altogether, replacing the gun with a silhouette or a close-up of Rambo's eyes. The tagline was translated not as "fighting for his life," but as "a man pushed too far." That linguistic nuance removed aggression and replaced it with existential strain, aligning the character with European post-war fatalism. In Japan, marketing leaned into the film's technological grit, promotional materials emphasized camera systems and realism, appealing to the country's fascination with craft and discipline. In each case, localization wasn't translation, it was cultural calibration. Audience analytics were rudimentary by modern standards, but Orion's marketing division operated like an early behavioral lab. They conducted exit interviews at key theaters across 4 U.S. cities, measuring emotional response and word-of-mouth potential. Data indicated a surprising trend. The quieter scenes, Rambo eating in silence, his breakdown monologue, produced higher audience engagement than action sequences. This insight reshaped the campaign mid-release. Later TV spots focused less on gunfire and more on emotional catharsis, culminating in the haunting use of Jerry Goldsmith's "It's a Long Road" theme in 30-second trailers. The strategy worked. Ticket sales spiked in the second and third weekends, a pattern atypical for action films whose revenue usually front-loads. The studio's merchandising strategy was initially hesitant. Unlike Star Wars or Raiders of the Lost Ark, First Blood didn't lend itself to toys or playsets. However, consumer response created unplanned demand. Sporting goods stores began requesting replicas of Rambo's survival knife after audiences asked for them. Carolco quickly licensed the design to United Cutlery, which went on to sell hundreds of thousands of units worldwide. It was one of the earliest examples of organic merchandise scaling, a product born from audience empathy rather than premeditated marketing. Public relations efforts leaned heavily on authenticity. Stallone and director Ted Kotcheff toured talk shows emphasizing the film's message about veteran struggles. Instead of glamour, they offered guilt and empathy, emotionally high-value commodities in the post-war economy of attention. Interviews highlighted the real veterans who served as extras or consultants, reinforcing the film's credibility. This was marketing through moral alignment, and it granted the movie something priceless: sincerity capital. Internationally, box office analytics revealed First Blood's asymmetrical success curve. In the US, its strongest demographic was men aged 18 to 35. In Europe, however, the audience skewed older, especially in France and Germany, where anti-establishment readings resonated deeply. Sociologists later noted that European viewers interpreted Rambo not as an American icon but as a universal archetype, the abandoned soldier of any empire. That interpretive elasticity made First Blood one of the first action films to achieve truly global narrative adaptability, a trait that modern franchises now engineer by design. From a financial marketing standpoint, the campaign's greatest strength was cost efficiency per impression. With a modest $8 million spend, it generated over $120 million in global gross, an ROI ratio of roughly 15-to-1 for advertising alone. By comparison, ET's marketing budget exceeded $20 million for a 10:1 return. First Blood demonstrated that precision targeting and psychological consistency yield better profitability than volume. It was cinema's equivalent of algorithmic advertising before the algorithm existed. Finally, the home video rollout in 1983 cemented the film's cultural longevity. Orion partnered with Thorn EMI Video for VHS distribution, priced competitively at $59.95 retail, lower than average to stimulate rental circulation. The film's rewatch value created sustained engagement. Families rented it not for spectacle but for identification. Surveys conducted by Variety in 1984 ranked First Blood among the top 10 most rented titles of the decade's first half. The studio learned that when an action movie offers emotional relatability, its replay economics multiply exponentially. In hindsight, First Blood's marketing success wasn't luck, it was literacy. The campaign read the emotional market like an analyst reading volatility charts. It identified the gap between what audiences claimed to want, action, and what they subconsciously needed, atonement. It positioned its protagonist not as product but as therapy. And in doing so, it redefined the playbook for 1980s Hollywood, teaching studios that true commercial power lies not in selling fantasy, but in selling forgiveness. When First Blood opened in October 1982, it arrived into a cinematic climate unprepared to understand it. Critics expected another bullet-soaked exploitation movie, another Reagan-era validation of militarized masculinity. What they got instead was a film that whispered instead of screamed, mourned instead of celebrated, and dared to humanize a soldier the system had discarded. The critical response was, at first, conflicted, a tension between those who saw brilliance in restraint and those who saw danger in sympathy. But within months, both the numbers and the narrative shifted. First Blood was no longer just a film, it was a cultural readjustment. On release, the New York Times called it a taut, muscular thriller with the surprising heart of a tragedy. Roger Ebert, writing for the Chicago Sun-Times, praised Stallone for stripping away vanity and leaving only vulnerability, giving the movie 3.5 stars out of 4. He noted, "This isn't about combat, it's about aftermath." Other major outlets followed suit, with Variety describing it as a psychological survival study disguised as an action picture. Yet some critics misread its intent. The Washington Post accused it of confusing pity for propaganda, suggesting that its sympathy for veterans might whitewash the war itself. That ideological tug-of-war reflected the broader American split over Vietnam's memory, and ironically validated the movie's core premise, misunderstanding as systemic reflex. Audiences, however, understood immediately. The film scored a on CinemaScore polls indicating strong word of mouth. Veterans groups responded with gratitude, not outrage. Many Vietnam survivors publicly thanked the filmmakers for portraying the alienation they felt on returning home. In one documented screening at a Denver VA center, multiple viewers reportedly wept during Rambo's breakdown scene, a reaction rare for an action film. That empathy feedback loop turned First Blood from a thriller into an emotional landmark. At the box office, its $125 million global gross, on a $15 million budget, made it one of 1982's top performers. But its true legacy was long-tail profitability. The VHS boom of the mid-1980s transformed First Blood into a perennial rental, keeping it on video charts for over 5 years. The character of John Rambo became cultural shorthand, a linguistic export. By 1984, newspapers were using Rambo as both noun and verb. To Rambo meant to retaliate without remorse. Ironically, the original film's quiet sadness had been reinterpreted by the masses as a symbol of raw, reactive power, a misreading that the sequels would commercially exploit. Critically, however, the film aged better than its louder descendants. Scholars in film and psychology now regard First Blood as one of the earliest mainstream treatments of post-traumatic stress disorder in American cinema. Academic essays trace its lineage alongside The Deer Hunter and Coming Home, but note its unique engineering of empathy through genre rather than drama. By wrapping trauma inside an action template, it smuggled grief into multiplexes, democratizing emotional literacy. Awards recognition, though modest, carried symbolic weight. First Blood received a BAFTA nomination for Best Original Score, Jerry Goldsmith, and several International Critics Awards for Stallone's performance. In France, the film won the Prix du Public at the Avoriaz Fantastic Film Festival, affirming its cross-cultural resonance. While Hollywood's major institutions overlooked it, the movie found longevity in what investors call reputational compounding. Over time, it accrued value, influence, citation, imitation, far beyond what trophies could quantify. The movie's legacy in filmmaking economics is profound. It proved that emotionally intelligent action films could yield elite profit margins. Studios took note. Columbia, Paramount, and 20th Century Fox recalibrated their production slates to include mid-budget, high-psychology thrillers. The Die Hard and Terminator models trace their DNA directly to First Blood's cost efficiency and tone, a blueprint where empathy and explosion coexist within budget discipline. Carolco's executives used First Blood's financial success to secure credit lines that would later finance Total Recall and Terminator 2. In that sense, Rambo didn't just survive the jungle, he built a financial ecosystem for modern Hollywood. The film also became a case study in cultural rebranding. Over time, Rambo's name became synonymous with excess, thanks to sequels that traded melancholy for nationalism. Yet that transformation only amplified the power of the original. Rewatching First Blood after the sequels is like rereading a poem before the marketing department turned it into a slogan. The contrast reminds audiences that what began as critique evolved into commodity, a meta-commentary on capitalism's ability to consume its own moral warnings. From an educational standpoint, First Blood continues to appear on syllabi in psychology, sociology, and film studies. Professors use it to demonstrate the intersection of masculinity, trauma, and economics. Its data, production budget, global performance, franchise ROI, supports lessons in behavioral marketing and brand lifecycle management. The film's ongoing value lies in this interdisciplinary versatility, a work that's both emotionally humane and economically instructive. Culturally, the film's image system remains embedded in collective memory. The rain-soaked veteran, the sheriff's badge glinting under fog, the faint hum of "It's a Long Road," these visuals have transcended genre. They've become archetypes for alienation itself. From the Bourne Identity to The Dark Knight, the lineage is clear. The haunted operative, the system that fears him, the redemption that never arrives. Each modern antihero owes something to the geometry of Rambo's solitude. In terms of critical reevaluation, the last 2 decades have seen First Blood climb in esteem. Publications like Empire and Sight and Sound now list it among the top action films of all time, not for spectacle but for structure. Scholars praise its narrative economy, the perfect 3-act rhythm that doubles as moral gradient. Its 87-minute runtime wastes nothing, every minute compounding emotional return. It's the cinematic equivalent of lean manufacturing. No excess, no indulgence, maximum resonance. The film's legacy forecast remains robust. With modern audiences increasingly drawn to authenticity and grounded narratives, First Blood feels prophetic. Its low-saturation palette, minimalist dialogue, and morally ambiguous tone anticipate the aesthetics of contemporary prestige television. Breaking Bad, True Detective, The Last of Us. These modern works inherit its DNA, empathy as spectacle, pain as currency. As long as society continues producing veterans, workers, and outsiders left behind by systems they once served, First Blood will remain relevant. Even its financial afterlife endures. Lionsgate, the current rights holder, continues to monetize Rambo through remastered Blu-rays, 4K restorations, and streaming bundles. Each re-release reactivates nostalgia markets and yields fresh educational licenses. The film's long-tail ROI now spans 40 years, an astonishing metric for an industry obsessed with quarterly returns. In that sense, First Blood achieved the rarest form of profitability, moral capital that accrues interest. Ultimately, critics came to realize that First Blood wasn't about violence at all. It was about value, human value, economic value, emotional value, and what happens when a system misprices it. Its reviews matured as society did. The same papers that once accused it of romanticizing brutality now praise its empathy. Time, like capital, rewards patience. And 4 decades later, First Blood stands not merely as a film but as an enduring market lesson. If you invest in truth, your returns compound forever. My literature-loving friends, there's a haunting stillness that follows First Blood. Not the silence of closure but of comprehension, that fragile moment when art, technology, and commerce stop competing and begin to harmonize. Ted Kotcheff's film, often remembered for its mud, blood, and thunder, is in truth an engineering symphony where every discipline, psychology, optics, finance, and sound, performs in emotional unison. What began as a modest $15 million venture became proof that a movie could be built like a machine yet beat like a heart. In First Blood, art and capital are not enemies. They are co-signatories of purpose. The film takes the mechanical logic of Hollywood, investment, risk, yield, and transforms it into something spiritual. Every decision feels dual-coded, creative and financial, emotional and industrial. The rain that softens light also saves on rigs. The small cast that focuses our empathy also keeps payroll lean. The forest that isolates Rambo doubles as a cost-free set of infinite production design. It is cinema behaving like nature, efficient, adaptive, self-correcting. Technologically, the movie stands at the exact hinge between analog and modern Hollywood. Laszlo's cameras, Goldsmith's Prophet 5 synthesizer, Warner's reel-to-reel sound design, all are tools that demand human precision. Nothing is automated, yet everything feels engineered. Each flare, each echo, each exposure curve works like a sensor reading emotion. The result is a film that feels tactile because it was tactile. Every image developed by light, not pixels. Every sound carved by hand, not software. In an age obsessed with digital abundance, First Blood reminds us that scarcity sharpens sincerity. Financially, it is the perfect case study in cinematic equilibrium. For every dollar spent, emotion multiplied. Carolco and Orion treated empathy as their highest yield asset, building marketing not on explosion but introspection. They didn't sell Rambo as superhero, they sold him as symptom, the human cost of mismanaged glory. And that honesty paid back with interest. $125 million in theaters, hundreds more in rentals, and billions in cultural attention. It is the rare film where conscience and capital share the same spreadsheet. Psychologically, First Blood cracked open the male archetype and audited its contents. Rambo isn't power personified, he's power traumatized, the machine that learned to feel after the factory shut down. The technology that built him, training, hierarchy, violence, collapses when confronted with empathy. His tears at the end are not breakdown but breakthrough. A man returning to analog emotion after years of institutional coding. That scene is cinema's most profitable silence. No music can outscore truth spoken without armor. The harmony between art and technology reaches its peak in form itself. Notice how every department mirrors the film's central philosophy: less control, more consciousness. The cinematography allows imperfection, the sound design allows quiet, the editing allows time for breath. Even the marketing respected subtlety, rare in any industry driven by volume. The movie's machinery breathes, and because it breathes, it lives. That is not efficiency alone, that is grace. For decades later, First Blood endures because it discovered the formula few films ever balance: emotional liquidity. It converts pain into value, memory into market, and solitude into solidarity. It shows how industry can serve intimacy, how an enterprise built for profit can teach compassion without losing shareholders. Its legacy isn't measured in sequels or box office anymore. It's measured in influence, in every story that dares to ask what happens after the war ends, when the soldier comes home and the applause doesn't. The true artistry of First Blood lies in its restraint. It teaches that power isn't what explodes, it's what endures. That engineering isn't about building the biggest machine, but the most precise one. That cinema, like any technology, is ethical only when it listens to the people it portrays. And that empathy, when rendered with intelligence, can outperform any spectacle on the market. As the credits fade and Goldsmith's final notes drift into that aching melody of "It's a Long Road," you can almost hear the hum of reconciliation, between man and machine, soldier and society, art and arithmetic. It's the sound of cinema finding its moral frequency. And maybe that's why, 40 years later, we still return to that forest. Because somewhere inside its mist and echoes lives the promise that creativity and capitalism don't have to destroy each other, that they can, on rare and beautiful days, build something sacred together. If you found this deep dive meaningful, my literature-loving friends, consider liking and subscribing so we can keep decoding the business and beauty of cinema together.